let me pause there and make sure that I'm getting at your question.
Senator Roth, please.
How to work this thing. I'll wait my turn, Mr. Chair.
Actually, go ahead so you can stand on top of it.
You know, I hate to interrupt. I have listened to some of this last week during the greenhouse gas reduction spending plan discussion. Why is it when we talk about these programs that nobody, at least to date, briefs a program in terms of goals, objectives, and milestones? Why is it that I don't hear about a short-term goal and objective, a midterm, a long-term, and then why is it in the briefing I don't hear whether we're short-term, midterm, or long-term, what the results are? We spend a lot of money on these programs. We impact a lot of people. We impact a lot of businesses. And I think it's incumbent on those of you there to set these goals and objectives and milestones, to measure progress, and to come back and tell us whether we're winning or losing the battle. It hasn't happened yet, so maybe we're early in the hearing. Maybe it's going to happen. If I have to step out because they gavel us in down there and I miss it, I'll catch it on TV. But that's what I'm interested in hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. So on that note, for your onboard diagnostics, can you tell us what you expect to see in terms of greenhouse gas reductions?
So specifically, OBD is a criteria emission reduction effort. We have not begun to use, and I say we haven't begun yet, we have not begun to take advantage of OBD as a greenhouse gas reduction measure. We can talk about the benefits in terms of criteria, and it's a critical tool for that. So at this point in time, we are not going to start using OBD for greenhouse gas benefits until a few years into the future.
So what is the goal?
The goal of OBD, broadly speaking, is to make sure that when a car has an emission-related problem, we can do two things that are critically important. One, we can actually identify that car that has the problem so that we can do something about it. And second, perhaps the most important, is when it comes to fixing the problem, OBD actually tells you or the mechanic or anybody who's looking into the issue where exactly the problem is. Without it, you essentially be blind in terms of you could identify an emission problem, but without it, you would have no means of knowing what the problem is. So it's a critically important element of our light-duty program.
So there is a specific goal?
The goal is, yes, the goal is, again, to ensure that the emission benefits of the control technology in the car are operating properly.
A measurable goal.
Correct. And when there's a problem, that the system will be able to tell us where to go and fix that problem within that car.
Okay. And so what are the program costs just on that basis?
So,
because what I'm seeing, sir, is in this first, in the matrix, and we want you to have every opportunity to provide the correct information. On the program expenditures on the vapor recovery regulations, onboard diagnostics, entire inflation regulation, we have no program expenditure information, and then program goals, they're not there either as far as being provided. And if there are numbers that we need to plug in there, please give them to us, because right now this looks like we're just putting things out there without goals or where we're at in as far as metrics going forward. And so we need that to know how effective that program. As Senator Bella said, maybe we need to reallocate resources that things are more effective. If you're showing us that the goals haven't been met or we can't attain them economically, that's the whole purpose. We want to be helpful. Sure. So,
Chairman, will you allow me? I think I wanted to, and I think it's responsive to a question that you posed, and it's an important one, because there are, even when we think about goals, there are multiple goals here. There are certainly individual programmatic goals in terms of tracking, enforcement, certification. But if I take one step back and ask, what is, in a sentence, in a clear sentence, what is the overall goal? It's achieving the healthy air quality standards. These are very specific standards with very specific measurements as to whether or not they're achieved. There's 200 plus air quality monitors across the state, several of which we operate. Those stations are operated for a very specific purpose. What is the air quality where people live? What levels of exposure, or what are the concentrations that they're exposed to? Directionally, are we being effective? Are we moving in the right direction? Is the air healthier today from an air quality standpoint than it was a few decades ago? And without qualification on this, the air quality is substantially better in terms of ozone standards, in terms of PM 2.5. All this data, and this is an enormous amount of information, is all publicly posted. What we measure, how we measure, and the progress that is being made. So really, there's multiple levels. The program as we implement, but two, the ultimate, what are we trying to achieve? Healthy air quality across the state, reduced emissions of air toxics, and reduced GHGs. Are those things measured, monitored, and reported on? They are.
So absolutely agree with you, and you're making strides, we hope. But you need to be able to quantifiably tell us what programs are working and what are not working, and that's what we're looking for here. And we don't know that your strategy is actually the one that is making it happen. And so you need to be able to show us the ability to do so. That's what we're looking for, and be able to provide the measures that we're looking for for accountability and transparency, that the people's money is being spent in a fashion that actually accomplishes all of our goals. And so that's what we're looking for. And so, Ms. Baker, you have a question?
I do. It could be echoing yours, but just what I was hearing, Mr. Corey, was you have a lot of data out there to show what the measurements are of air quality in one area, but what we're not seeing is a connection between all the 50 programs plus and those measures. Is the reason why we've done so much better because the economy went down and had nothing to do with so many of the programs and regulations we have? Is it a mix of that or a mix of specific programs? That's what we actually could really desperately use, is a more something that could be subject to pretty rigorous peer review on here's a program we are doing and here's the result it's having that is measurable. And so can you address that? Because we're not seeing that both in the matrix and in your answer. And it's highlighted a bit by Mr. Ayala, because I think I heard the chairman say, what is the measurable goal that you have? And I didn't hear an answer to that one. I heard an agreement that it should be a measurable goal, but not what it is.
So, again, we'd be more than happy to work with the committee to make sure that we get the information in the format that you need it. I think what we're seeing is a reflection that perhaps the way we think about tracking progress is a little different than the more discrete nuggets of information that the committee may be after. I wonder if at this point it wouldn't make sense, before we launch into specifics, to talk a little bit about our emission inventory and how it feeds into this broader, because we do have an idea in terms of being able to apportion, frankly, the credit and the benefit of, for us to state that we're making progress in our quality. We do have the information that supports the fact that it is because of our measures. So I wonder if maybe before we launch into them, we'd be more than happy to get into some of the detail that we brought for you onto specific ideas, but perhaps talking more broadly in terms of how we actually go about tracking progress, perhaps that may be more beneficial at this point.
Yeah, and it seems more data is needed so we can tell how these programs are actually doing, if they're successful or not. And I think what you need to do and tell us is if it would be better to do this in-house, or have an outside evaluator come in and actually see what's been achieved up to this point and how it's been achieved. And again, as Assemblymember Baker has stated, was it because of other reasons? The recession, the economy, a mixture thereof. But I think what we're looking for is, this has been 10 years and we do have cleaner air. And thank you for your agency for being so diligent. But we need to be able to be accountable for the dollars that are spent to accomplish this. And is there a better value of 50 programs going forward? Maybe we need to look at something that's a little more attainable via an economy. And so that's the whole purpose, is just to be able to work with you, give you as many tools in the toolbox as you need to accomplish it, but in a manner that is the best use of the people's money.
We understand that, Chair. And in fact, and invite really what you're describing to me is a very deep dive on individual measures, actions. We invite that, and we invite the conversation about what metrics are monitored, documented, reported on. It gets to the point that I made, and clearly they vary. For instance, just using one example, benzene and gasoline, and lead. Lead was phased out of gasoline. Benzene is much lower. Benzene's a human carcinogen. We established standards years ago in fuel to phase out or substantially reduce benzene and gasoline. How do we know that's happening? How do we know it's working? Well, one, the air quality is about 90% less measured benzene. If I go to an air monitor, irrespective of where I go in the state, it's about 90% less than it was just a few decades ago. Two, we sample fuel. So we know that those levels are being met. But the answer in terms of what's measured is really a function of the different programs and reported on. But it may be useful, Chair, if you'll indulge. I do have my Kurt Kaparis, who's the lead of our overall inventory group, and there's a link to the SIP question in terms of how do we inform the measures that we pursue? How do we prioritize? Why is one measure more important to pursue than another? And I think it lays out that underlying rationale, and part of it gets to Senator Roth's question about the relationship or previous question between the stationary source AQMP and the mobile source measures. So
what I would like to do is continue to work on the questions at hand, Mr. Corey, instead of other people taking over the hearing. How much money is spent on light vehicle duty programs to date? I don't have that in my matrix, and so I'd like to know just on that program alone, how much money is being spent on the light vehicle duty program.
So let me then go back and give you the specifics on OBD, because again, that's one of the main components of the light duty program. You wanted to know the details.
No, I asked how much we're spending on that program. That's my question now.
Right. So
we've gone through the analysis of what it does through the OBD and whatnot. I just want to know how much is being spent.
Let me respond to your question. The way that we have historically tracked our expenditures in our budget is at the legislative appropriation level. So it's a matter of how much segregation is there. So the line items in the budget, we document, report. In fact, we've had the Bureau of State audits they're in this year, and they've been in the last 2 years. They'll audit us probably every year going forward. There's been DOF and DGS audits, but the documentation and tracking, which there certainly is tracking, it's at a rolled-up mobile source GGRF level. Now, we have beginning this past fiscal year, began to document at the specific, much more detailed program level. And the way that we do that is we actually included all those line items in people's timesheets to document at what level individual programs. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm being very direct in how we document, we certainly document, but it's consistent with the legislative appropriations in the budget, and that is certainly something we could provide and have done historically and will continue to do.
And I think this committee is asking for how much has been spent, and if you can get that information going forward, that would be very helpful. And we do get your analysis of what you spend globally on ARB through the budget process and through appropriations and whatnot. And so I appreciate that, but any private company who has Quicken can track their employees' time. And so this is what we want to be able to do. If it's been 10 years since you've started this, I appreciate that. And I think ongoing would be what we're really looking for is what is the best value going forward. So do you have that amount that's being spent?
So if you would allow me, let me give you some approximate numbers. The light duty program, very specifically, in terms of the agency's commitment, We have approximately a team that is dedicated to light duty of about 100 of our staff. So that'll give you a sense of the magnitude of the impact. In terms of actual expenditures related to the program, we probably spend on the order of $300,000 a year. So that's the magnitude of that light duty program. Again, embedded into that program, we have the OBD component to that. We talked a little bit about that. On OBD, we have a team of approximately 30 people, 30 of our experts that focus specifically on OBD. And again, the expenditures related to the program are on the order of $200,000. And if you want, we can discuss where the money goes. But again, we do have, as Mr. Corey alluded to, we do have an accounting in terms of the resources that are going into each of the components that you see listed in the matrix.
Yeah, and I think I look at it as if I was the CEO of a company and I had to report to my shareholders, that I would want to know what those detailed expenditures were so that I could be accountable for them. So that's what we're looking for, is just to be able to acknowledge that, the program's there, and you can show us that the expenditure and where it's at as far as its goal metrics goes forward. If you're halfway there, quarter of whatever, so that we can say that, that the money was well spent, in our opinion, because we are the legislature, we are the funding mechanism that funds the program, and so and the deciders, if it gets funded. And so this is what we want to do, is be a part of that, so that we may want to reallocate resources throughout that and say this isn't working so well, and have that dialogue that, maybe can we weigh in on this? That's what we're looking for also, to be a part of that solution too. But with that, I look forward to a more detailed report about goals, where we're at, and the expenditure to point per year on that. That would be very, very, very helpful. Is there any other questions of committee staff or committee members? Excuse me. Let's go with Mr. O'Donnell and then Ms. Baker.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and thank you. And I'm going to ask the question, probably it's already been asked. I walked in, so a little bit of this is for me, and I appreciate people being patient with me. So let me just read a statement, and you can tell me whether or not it's correct, because I'm reading it off one of the committee sheets here. And I'll paraphrase just the first portion. CARB does not collect data on the success of individual regulatory programs. Consequently, there is no way for the legislature to assess the success of any given program, either alone or as compared to other related programs. Is that an accurate statement?
It's not accurate. The question is, what data is collected? And the answer to the type of data that's collected is a function of the type of program it is. And I'm going to give you two examples, and my colleagues here may have others if you have follow-up questions. The example I gave a minute ago on fuel quality. How is fuel quality data collected? Well, you sample the fuel. You do the analysis, you run it through equipment, and you pull those samples at different points in the chain, at a refinery and through the trucks and all the way down to a gas station. For a motor vehicle, car, you actually certify the engine. You test it. You pull vehicles off in use that are tested when they're out there in the public. You have a smog check program that also provides data. So there's certainly data for each program. I think the issue, and honestly I'm just being straight up in terms of sort of the dissonance in terms of, wait a minute, the characterization, because staff did, were very diligent in the follow-up that they did. And I think we're talking a different language because there's data, but I think it was the nature of the data, and the nature of the data is a function of the specific program that you're talking about and how that data is tracked.
But wouldn't it make sense in a governmental or even private sector agency that you would match dollars to success or lack of success in any given program? And what you're telling me is that really doesn't exist?
No, what I was saying is we certainly track expenditures, but the expenditures, it was a matter of what is the degree of disaggregation. We track them at the mobile source level, and we track them in a few other categories that are laid out. There's multiple categories in the budget. They're tracked at that level, and the point that I was making to the chairman was that in addition to that, which we have that record historically for as long as we've been in place, but going forward, we realized there would be added value of tracking at a much deeper level, actually at the program level. So the way to do that, and we begin that this fiscal year, is add line items. The way to do it was really at the staff level, time spent on individual programs, several dozen programs. You called out the mobile source programs, there are others. And that's what we put in place going forward. So we historically absolutely tracked the budget and documented it. It's a matter of further disaggregation that we have put that system in place, and we'll have those reports in the future.
So that's how you're tracking. Go ahead.
Real quick, if I may. So I get you know, there's some conversation here today about further disaggregating the dollars. I appreciate that. But what about the success of those dollars and the success of each individual program, giving them a single measure, if you will, as opposed to measuring them in a larger group?
Right. And
so it's not just dollars, it's also outcomes.
Certainly
Inputs the dollars, outputs the success.
And I think part of that conversation is is the effectiveness of a given program measured. Part of it is enforcement. Part of it is different field measurements. Part of it, if it's an incentive program, is what programs got those dollars and what was the success of those projects. So, I mean, at the heart of your question is, you know, how effective were actions. That's an important, I think, and my point is there's different, depending on the particular program, there's different metrics and ways to report it.
So how do we get those metrics?
I
mean, let's take an example. I represent the 70th Assembly District, which takes in the two ports of Long Beach, Los Angeles. Okay, you know, you've been heavily engaged down there for sure. So when we do enforcement on some of the trucks,
Yes.
I mean, we know that if there's 56 citations, that means supposedly there should be 56 fixes, and somehow I assume that is measured.
Mm-hmm. It is, and the port's a great example because the ports have been real leaders and very good partners with us, by the way. And the ports, and we'll be the first to say this, and I say this everywhere I go, in terms of in 10 years, 2005 to 2015, diesel particulate emissions from the ports, as well as near source exposure, and these are many low-income disadvantaged communities, it's been reduced 80%. If you ask, well, how'd that happen? Happened through a number of measures. One, it happened through the drayage truck program. The trucks are much cleaner, and they don't let them in if they're not cleaner. Happened through cargo handling equipment. They're much cleaner engines that they're using. It happened through fuel requirements in terms of cleaner fuels on those ships. It happened through plugging those ships, the regulation where they have to plug in at berth. Collectively, those measures have worked together to yield results that are undeniable, and it's one of the reasons people are coming around the world to see how the ports have been so effective in terms of reducing diesel PM emissions.
Great, thank you. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is multiple measures, multiple efforts require multiple measures. I think so that we just don't get a bucket.
I understand.
And we can see that segregated out a little bit. And and one of the things you said, which I very much appreciate, was heading forward in a partnership. And that's what made the Clean Trucks program so successful. It was a partnership. So when we look at the sustainable freight strategy and we look at the facilities cap, I'm really scratching my head right now, trying to identify how that can be a partnership where you've got a warehouse that's 60 years old. How are they going to meet their new requirements if, they're basically a stationary place? And how would you partner with a warehouse under a facilities cap? That's a conversation we don't necessarily need to delve into today. But that's something I'm going to be asking to make sure that we're just coming up with a reasonable policy. And just stepping back a minute, too, big picture. I opened the LA Times, 3-4 weeks ago, and there was an article about the AQMD in battle with CARB. And it talked about how the agencies had some kind of disagreement. There was even potential talk of a lawsuit. And, I'm looking at this. As a classroom teacher, when there was a fight in my classroom, it was always my responsibility. I actually didn't have any, but it would have been my responsibility. And, I'm responsible for your actions ultimately because I'm the guy that they elect. And I'm looking at this fight between two agencies, and I'm scratching my head on a Saturday morning, and I can tell you what, the neighbor down the street doesn't understand CARB, doesn't understand AQM, just knows that there's two agencies talking about fighting each other in the LA Times. And how am I supposed to explain that to my constituents?
Now, I didn't see the LA Times article, but I do want to go at this point because it's a personal priority of
Mr.
mine.
Corey, I'm going to give you a little bit to answer that question, then we're going to get back on topic.
Okay, I will do it in 1 minute or less.
Thank you.
I would argue this is somewhat on topic.
Barry Wallerstein, Executive Director of South Coast Air Quality Management District. One of the priorities of our organization, our agency, and a priority of mine since I've had this position was to strengthen our relationship with local air districts. We are more effective in terms of dealing and fighting and managing air quality issues and moving towards clean air if we're in partnership. Barry, let's see, I've talked to him yesterday. I've been working on Aliso Canyon partnership, doing monitoring around that site. I talked to him this morning. We have a stronger partnership than we probably ever have had. So that working relationship, and you can ask people independently and check, ground truth what I'm telling you, is as strong as it's ever been. Do we have some air quality challenges that we're working through with the district and other districts? Of course we are, but is our partnership strong and are we effectively working together? I'll be the first to say absolutely yes, and ask him and others.